Welcome to Refused Flank, a wargaming podcast exploring the intersection of competitive excellence and narrative storytelling potential.
Hey, this is Cam, and today we've got another solo show, as, schedules are getting a little more complicated around the holidays, etc. But next week we'll be back with both Grant and myself, so you can look forward to that. But this week I'm going to just talk a little bit more about the board that I made for Necropolis28. We had mentioned this on one of our hobby update videos a couple weeks ago, and I had said I'd post pictures of it, never did. So this video will include some footage of the board itself, and I'm going to talk just through a little bit of my process in building it, some of the opportunities I had, some of the challenges I ran into, elements that I didn't quite get to finish, and just talk through how that process went. So as I mentioned, the purpose of this board was for a specific event that a local group was putting on for Necropolis28. And so if you're not familiar with that, that's a skirmish game where everybody plays as some sort of an undead lord with necromantic powers, and then you have a number of little minions that you can resurrect and throw around and things like that. The game is played on just an 18-inch square, so a pretty tiny playing surface in terms of wargaming. When you think about a normal army-sized game is on a 6-foot by 4-foot table, only 18 inches square is quite small. And when I learned about that, I was like, okay, that's cool. We got to kind of fit a lot into a small area, try to make that interesting. And the first thing that came to my mind was trying to go vertical with it. So if I only have an 18-inch footprint, how could I maximize that space by using the height of it as well? So initially I thought, I'll make it like a cube and I'll do 18 inches cubed. And that ended up being quite tall, so I didn't quite go that high with it. The finished height of the playing surface is about 11 inches, and with some of the additional decorative elements on top, it goes up to about 15, 16 inches. But I think with any creative project, when you have restraints, it actually can breed creativity. If you have completely open-ended opportunity to do kind of whatever you want, I think that can in some ways be paralyzing because you don't really know which direction to go. You don't have any sort of guidance. And having a restriction like this, it's got to just be 18 inches square, was actually for me really freeing to then sort of play within those restraints. So I think that's just a little side tip for creative projects. If you feel like you're a little stuck on something or can't get traction, apply some restraints. And maybe they're arbitrary, maybe they're for a specific purpose like this was for this game. But either way, I think those restraints can really help. Some of the other opportunities that existed for this was the fact that the game has a built-in mechanic for what they call, I think, portals. And so you can pick two different spots on the battlefield and say, if you interact with this spot, you'll pop out at this spot. And so for me, that triggered this idea of okay, maybe there's a way from this top level to portal down to the lower level, which could be a magical portal teleportation kind of thing. But I was imagining, okay, maybe there's a staircase that goes down. And maybe there's this crypt thing at the top, sort of like a barrow entrance, and then some stairs that would wind down. And I don't need to fully model that because, again, you can just sort of see that the stairs start, then you can interact with that and then pop out halfway down the mountain. So this was my initial idea for me to add that verticality. And I thought, okay, that's going to be this central column that's going to be able to go up or down, and that's how you will navigate this. I started to run into some issues with that, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Another opportunity with this was just to play with some new techniques. I've painted plenty of rocks in my wargaming terrain journey so far, but almost all of them have just been black or dark gray with a light gray dry brushed over that. And that works pretty well, it's fine, but it definitely doesn't have that realistic rock effect. And over the years, I've seen some different tutorials and certainly seen some examples, on Instagram and other YouTube videos of really realistic looking rock faces. And I thought this would be a cool opportunity to try some of those techniques myself. And I knew at some point I had seen a terrain tutor video in particular that I had saved somewhere. And so looked that back up, and that was going to then be sort of a guiding light for me. Okay, I'm going to try some of these new techniques for making the rock faces actually look a little bit more realistic, which at its core is just the idea of adding a little bit more color than just gray. So having these different minerals and metals that are part of the rock face in with the stone, all of that adds different colors. And of course, things like moss or lichen and all of that can add a little bit of green and browns and those sorts of things. So with all that in mind, I started thinking about materials I could use. I had some plywood lying around from some shelves I had taken apart in my basement. So cut an 18-inch square out of that plywood shelf and that became my base. And then I used a couple different kinds of foam to build up from there. I had some 2-inch of that like beaded kind of crappy foam that's not normally very good for terrain building because of that texture and crumbliness. But I was planning on covering everything with filler, and so that was going to work for me. It was going to be a good way to get some height quickly. So I did about half of the height with that, and then the rest I did with XPS foam, 1-inch foam. And like I said, I used a lot of filler and did some texturing with that using a ball of rolled up aluminum foil, and then also this strange chunk of plastic that came from a failed print. Somehow I got a clog, and then this like crazy monster of filament built up around the print head, and it had all sorts of weird texture on it. So I used that as well just to try to add some more different texture to the rock face that I was covering with filler. For the XPS parts of the rock face, I used a hot wire cutter to cut some sort of horizontal lines to look a little bit more like maybe sedimentary rock. And then used a lot of texture paint as well. I can't remember what brand, AK Interactive or Vallejo or something like that. But that was just going to save me some time in terms of like doing PVA glue and sand or whatever. I just used this texture paste, and that helped get me my base ground texture. I used 2 different ones. There's sort of this more irregular texture, but then for a couple of path areas, I used a finer sand type texture. And I think that, along with the paint difference, just helps separate areas of the ground and not feel quite as samey. The other main ingredient that I used was air dry clay and a texture roller, which was also something new to me. I've done a texture roller before on just foam in order to do like a block stone texture for castle walls, but I had never used it on air dry clay like this, which again is something I've seen a bunch of. I've had friends who've used that sort of a thing for bases or whatever. And so this was another opportunity just to try this new technique and see how it worked. So I found a 3D printable texture roller and did that, and then got some air dry clay, rolled it out, and used that to make some sort of cobblestone looking paths down for the bottom layer of this whole thing. And of course used a bunch of glue, I think a lot of wood glue, hot glue, just a regular knife to make additional cuts into the foam, acrylic paint, all the regular things, and then some 3D printed accessories as well. So I have some of these little like totems that are placed around as almost little like vignettes as you go down through the mountain. I built the barrow entrance out of additional XPS foam, and then I have a 3D printed dead tree that's kind of hugged up against it. And the final little bit, which I'll get to a little bit later, is this crack in the mountain at the bottom, and I have a little stone, a sort of partially opaque stone down there that's green, and that was just one other little detail I wanted to add, as well as just little bits of lichen here and there glued around, just to break up the stone texture. So like I said, one of the core things I was trying to play with here was verticality. And as I mentioned, I started with just this idea of a central column that would have this staircase from the crypt down to the bottom of the mountain. At some point I decided, well, maybe that pops out halfway down the mountain, and then it kind of like curves a path around, and there's some more stairs going down. I had imagined that at the top, maybe there was a bridge that was coming from off board, and sort of you see sort of like half the bridge, and then that hits the top central area. That didn't end up panning out. There wasn't really a good way to support that bridge and make it work, and thinking about playability, wasn't sure it was really going to be useful. So 86 to that idea. But as I was starting to design this and sort of rough it out with just the shapes of the foam and things like that, I started to realize that a problem with my concept of it being just this kind of central spire was that there was only going to be one way up or down. And so it'd be pretty easy to get bottlenecked somewhere along that, and then a lot of the tables not even getting played on. So I think when you're designing a table or terrain in general, you kind of have to think almost in terms of like level design in a video game. And so if you're thinking about, like a Halo multiplayer map or something like that, you need these multiple routes, different ways that people can sneak up on each other and get around the map in different ways. And so I try to engage a little bit of that part of my brain and thinking about, okay, there's this central way up and down that sort of has this wrap around the spire, but are there any other ways that we could get up there? And so that's where I came up with this idea of this little side ledge. And so right from the top corner, you can sort of hop down a couple steps. I had to look up the measurements for movement and jumping and things that are in Necropolis28 just to make sure that those were legally passable, that you actually could hop from one to the other. And then made it so you could kind of walk down the side there and then hop across to this ledge and then get down that way. And I thought, okay, maybe this just provides one alternative route. So you can't just completely roadblock the one way up and down the mountain and then bog down the game. That still seemed maybe a little bit limited. So I flipped around to the other corner and was building this additional barrow sort of thing that I wanted, this little playable interior thing there, and tried to make it so that you would be able to jump from that up to that halfway up the column ledge. And that would be kind of a big jump, but doable. And again, it kind of depends on the system you're playing. I think in Relic Blade, you could probably still make that jump if you rolled well. But those are all things to consider. I think as you're designing, if you have a specific system in mind, you want to make sure that you understand what are some of the distances involved for movement, for ranged attacks, things like that, so that things actually end up playable. And a lot of times those might happen in 1 or 2 inch intervals and things like that, or be based on move stats. But all of those things are important to keep in mind as you're designing a battlefield that's going to actually be playable and fun. And I think playability really was one of the guiding lights that I honestly went back and forth on a lot. And I think it can often be hard to find a good balance between something that looks really cool and realistic and something that is playable. So another example of that on this board is the stairs. So there's obviously this long walk down around the spire, and that required elevation change, which makes sense to do with stairs. But as anybody listening who's played a tabletop miniatures game, stairs don't work very well with miniatures because a realistically sized step, which these are even larger than would be realistic, honestly, do not accommodate 28 millimeter miniatures and their base. So unless you have some sort of device that, slots in against the stairs, which I have seen and could work, that you could set your guys on, stairs often end up not being very playable. So I think that's one of the weaknesses of this board, is all of the stairs that aren't really playable. You kind of have to put your guys in between those areas, or talk to your opponent and be like, oh, I'm kind of like halfway up the stairs, right? That sort of a thing. And if you're designing a board, I mean, those are just good things to avoid if you can. Another concern that came up as I was designing this related to playability was just how tight some of it ended up being. I had some additional ideas of adding more gravestones and things down on this lower corner here, and even as I was putting in this additional barrow on this corner, it started creating this really narrow channel. And I started thinking about, okay, are you even going to be able to reach your hands in here and move your miniatures effectively? Or is that going to cause more problems? Are going to be bumping the board and knocking stuff over? And so again, especially if you're building a terrain dense board or something that has a lot of these, larger pieces in it, thinking about how are you actually going to access the miniatures is an important concern. To that end, I ended up adjusting the size of this barrow a little bit. I also ended up opting not to put the gravestones on this little flat area, just because there wouldn't have been much space left to put miniatures then. And I think that did leave this area feeling a little bit empty, but I think that open space is necessary just to have some playable area, so it's not just this sort of narrow path for the whole time down through. And ultimately, I think that improved playability. But again, it's that balance between, am I creating a diorama or am I creating a playable battlefield? And you have to constantly be asking that question. And as far as that goes, I think this barrow was a cool idea down here, and I like the idea of these sides being open. It's got sort of a playable interior. But any of the detail ideas I had, of like, oh, maybe there's like an altar in there or some sort of a tomb, there wasn't really room in there to do that. So now it's just kind of this awkwardly empty room. It's stuffed off in a corner. There's not really any reason to put your models in there, especially in Necropolis28. So I think unless a scenario was designed that utilized it or put an objective in there, that sort of a thing, this is now just kind of taking up space and looks cool from maybe a diorama perspective, but isn't necessarily very playable, especially with only the one entrance through this door, and the fact that it's as far as you can almost get from a lot of the other playable areas of the battlefield. Maybe if you were using this for an encounter for, an RPG session or something like that, you could design in some sort of a thing where the players are having to move down through this whole area and get to that barrow to get inside there or something like that. But as far as like a generic war game, two sides facing off type of scenario, I'm not sure this barrow was the best idea. Another thing I wanted to add was, again, some of those smaller details that just bring it to life. And I did that with some of these totemic pole things. But I wanted to have a bit more than that. But again, I was trying to balance between over cluttering things and having just not enough flat areas to actually place miniatures. Obviously, I was also battling time with a deadline for this event. And so between those two things, I think it did end up a little bit more sparse than maybe I would have liked. And even just adding other little details like maybe some skulls and bone piles here and there would have been cool, or, things like that. So always things to improve for next time. Or, I could honestly continue to add some of those things. I think one problem I run into, though, is if I get a project done enough that it kind of looks done when I glance at it, it can sometimes be difficult to get the motivation to come back to it and really start adding more things. So we'll see. I don't know if I'll ever get around to adding more. Another couple unfulfilled opportunities that I had were I was really excited to try some LED lighting for the first time in some terrain. We've got a guy in our 40K 4th Ed group who put some LED lights in one of his rhinos, and it just looked super cool. And so ever since I saw that in person, I was like, all right, I got to find a way to integrate LEDs into something. And so for this one, I thought, okay, maybe I could have like a little glow coming from the barrow entrance at the top. And then at the bottom, I also had this idea I mentioned earlier of the corrupt heart of the mountain. And it's got this like weird magical stone in it. And I thought, okay, if I could get an LED up behind there, then maybe it kind of glows through that stone and that could do some cool looking stuff as well. I ordered the stuff. I have pretty much everything I need to pull off the LED lighting, but just ran out of time and didn't get to do that part. I think little details like that can really bring something like this to life, really call attention to some of those fun little extra details and storytelling opportunities. And to that end, I didn't completely finish the idea that I had for that corrupted heart of the mountain. As you can see, it just is kind of the heart of the mountain. It's a little cracked crevice here. It's got a stone in it, but nothing about it really looks corrupt. So my initial idea with that was supposed to be taking some green stuff or modeling clay and create some sort of really creepy, fleshy, tentacle-y growth that was growing out of the mountain and causing this kind of crack to happen. And it had the stone embedded in it so that it was this, corrupted magical energy was beginning to grow this tumor in the mountain kind of an idea. And that I think would have fit really well with the Necropolis28 vibes and was once again just something that I overcommitted for the time I had available for this project and didn't end up getting to do that. So this little stone's just kind of jammed in there right now. It's not even glued. When you're doing a project like this, it's easy to dream. It's easy to have really big ideas and cool ideas of how you're going to do different things. And I think one key to success is being willing to hold some of those things loosely and to give them up in favor of completion, getting it done enough to actually use. So even though I didn't finish some of those extra details or ideas that I had, I'm glad that I didn't let that stop me from finishing the board, getting it to that event, and getting to see it in action. And in terms of finishing details, I did get all the edges painted black, but it really does create kind of a nice framing element to it, and so it almost feels a little bit more finished that way. One thing I did want to do was finish some filler. There's some gaps still along the edge between some of the terrain elements and that piece of plywood that look a little unfinished. Earlier on, I was also imagining, oh yeah, I'll do this like nice oak trim or something and stain it a nice dark color. Didn't get around to that, so maybe that's again someday we could add that to it as well. But for now, I think it definitely turned out well, looks nice. It could use some sealer on it. You can see here that I've already dinged it up on the way into the gaming store for this event. I accidentally bashed it on the side of my door in my car and put a dent in it. So I need to touch that up. But yeah, I think just a coat of clear varnish or something like that would probably be wise as a tool to keep this thing in good shape for a long time. Another thing to consider with a project like this, though, is what is the purpose of it going forward? So I made it for this specific event, for a specific game, that was the first time I was playing, and I don't necessarily have clear plans to play it more. And so now I feel a little bit like, well, what am I going to do with this? This isn't really easy to store, especially with the way the top is and has all these sort of different elements. That's going to make it a little difficult. I think I could probably use it for Relic Blade, which is technically played on a 2x2, but it's the type of system that's loose enough that that's not that important. And especially with the verticality, I think it adds a little bit more space than you would imagine for the 18x18 footprint. And there's plenty of other skirmish games that could get played on it. So now it's just a matter of, am I going to actually get it out and use it for those things and create those opportunities to do so? In some of these pictures, you can see some of my Relic Blade figures on there, so I really do hope to get some games of Relic Blade in on it. Somebody at the event said Doom 1490 would work well on it with the verticality, because that's, again, all about trying to get to the top of the board as fast as possible by the end. So I think that could be another potential opportunity. But in the end, it was a really fun project that I think turned out pretty well. I'm pretty happy. It's probably some of the best looking terrain that I've made, especially from a natural rock perspective. I had fun trying to add that texture, trying to blend the texture of the filler in with the texture of the just carved foam. And I think the approach that I used for painting the rock from that Terrain Tutor video was a fun process, because it's a little bit more expressive, where you're just kind of, using heavily diluted acrylic washes to kind of push some color here, push some color there, just kind of go on vibes and make it feel right. And I really like that approach to painting, which a lot of times, especially when you're painting miniatures, you can't really use, because there are those hard and fast details that you can't ish as much and at least get the outcome that I'm looking for often. So it was a really fun project in those terms. Again, really fun to dive into that level design perspective and thinking about how it would actually play. And I think that's helped me just in terms of thinking about how I lay out more modular terrain on my battlefields for other games as well, and considering pathfinding and where people are going to go, what opportunities are available to be exploited, that sort of a thing. And adding these little details was fun. I mean, I spent a lot of time just trying to find, what are these little statues that are going to be here? Are there any cool dead tree STLs that I could find that would really fit? And I found one that fit pretty close, had to do some trimming, and then sort of blend that into the surface of the rest of the ground. But I think that just really adds an additional element that makes the barrow entrance pop and feel a little bit more like it's been there a really long time, with this old gnarled tree built into it. And so, yeah, I just had a really fun time with this project, and would encourage you guys, if you've got an idea in mind, just go ahead and give it a go. I start small. I think this was maybe, as evidenced by some of the elements I didn't finish, a little bit too big of a bite for me to chew, but it really pushed me. It helped me to elevate some techniques that I wanted to learn and get better at. If you do have, little boards like this that you've built, I'd love to see pictures of them. If you can link to them in the comments, or if, got an Instagram or something, just give yourself a shout out. We'll check them out. And if you have any additional thoughts on designing playability into a board like this, or again, even in laying out modular terrain, I'm a huge sucker for a good dense terrain board that looks like a real place, that looks like, this could just be the spot that a battle happens to be taking place in, rather than a gaming board. I would love to hear, what are your thoughts on combining those two things, playability with that sort of sense of groundedness and reality in the battlefield? Or if there's other resources that you've come across that talk about that, throw them our way. But anyways, that's all I've got to say about this project. Again, this is my Necropolis28 board, and potentially to become a Relic Blade / etc. board. But let us know what you think in the comments, and otherwise we will talk to you again in a week. Bye.